we need to get the API so that we can actually retrieve data and then pass it inside jokes, inside the joke. So first of all, we need to implement this API call inside the jokes list. So we're going to usestate, so that we can actually wait for this component to mount, and when it's mounted, we will be applying this function. It's basically like component mount inside the class file, but we're doing this for React functional components. And we want to get useeffect from React. We want to import it, and we also want to use state as well. So we can set the data from when we get it from the API. We set it inside our state. Now we want to be using Axios to get the data from an API, and we need to install Axios so we can use it. So just npm install Axios and then -s. At the useeffect, we want to implement the getJokes. We're going to have a function called getJokes, and this function is going to get the data from the API, and it will set it inside our state. So we're going to implement this getJokes, and we're going to call it inside useeffect. So let's call it now as well from useeffect. It's going to be, make sure you put in the async, because we want to await for the data to be returned. So we're waiting for a promise to be returned to us, and to do that we need to use await. Or we can also use .then, but in this case we're just going to use await. So we need to add in the async. Now let's implement this getJokes function. So what we need to do is, first we're going to have just an empty array. We're going to do let new jokes is an empty array. And after that, we're going to give an ID for each joke. So we're just going to have a let ID variable. We'll do let ID equals 1. And this should keep track of our IDs, so we can increment it as we make another joke. We'll get another joke from the API. So now we want to implement a for loop, so we can repeat the code like a few times, so we can keep getting jokes from the API and then adding it to new jokes. Because the API that we are using, it only returns one joke at a time. So we want to use the for loop to keep getting jokes and adding it to our new jokes array. So we're going to do for var I is equal to 0. Actually, we'll set it to 1 because we're going to use this as an ID as well. And there's no point of having the let ID, so we can just remove that. And now we'll do while I is smaller than 7, for example. We'll do I++. And inside this for loop, we are going to now get the joke. So we're going to do let res is equal to await axios.get, and now we want to make sure to import Axios so you can actually use it for getting the jokes. And so we're awaiting Axios to get this specific URL, and it would have been better to put this URL inside a constant file or a config file, but in our case, because we are only using this one time, so we're just going to paste it right here. After that, we also need to pass in the headers so that we can see this is JSON data. So we're just going to do headers right now over here, and we're going to pass in an object, header object, which is just going to have an accept property, and it will be application/JSON, no capitals. Yeah. Now that should give us, so that's what that does. It is awaiting for the server to return the jokes. The joke, sorry, will give us one joke, and we are getting that data and putting it inside res, inside this res variable, and we are waiting for it to actually return before we continue. Now we want to push in a new jokes object, because we have a new jokes array over there, and we want to push in an object each time we go through the for loop. So we need to give this object an ID first, and the ID is just going to be I, and we want to give it a text, so the joke text, and we'll get this joke text from the response, which is going to be res.data.joke. And finally, the vote is going to be set to 0 because no one has voted on it so far. And after we have done this, this would basically loop over this. So this loop would run 7 times to get 6 times, sorry, and it will get the jokes, and it will add them inside new jokes. So once we have finished the for loop, now we can set the jokes inside our state. So now we need to implement a hook. So this hook will be used for setting jokes and getting the jokes. So we're going to do const. So we're going to have jokes and set jokes. So jokes will allow us to read the jokes, and set jokes will allow us to set the jokes. And we're going to be using usestate. So initially we want the state to be null. We don't have anything inside it. And yeah, so whenever we want to set jokes, we can call this function set jokes, which we will be doing right over here. And we are just passing in the new jokes. Before we return the data for the list, we want to first check if we actually have jokes inside state. So we want to do if jokes, then we will return the actual jokes list. Otherwise, we will just return a loading h1 that says loading. Okay, so there's something that we need to fix before we continue. I have a double S over here for votes. In case you've done it like that, then it should be 1S. Now let's go ahead and return a joke. Let's map over all the jokes that we have inside from our API that we have in state, and we want to return the joke components for each joke that we have. So we're just going to do jokes.map. First we want to check if no, actually we don't need to, because we're already checking if we have jokes over here, so we don't need to check before we map. We can just go ahead and do jokes.map, and then that should give us an arrow function that gives us the joke, and we can return the joke. Now we need to implement the properties for the joke. So we're simply just mapping over the jokes from our state, and we're returning the joke components, and we will be passing the properties of the joke components. So the properties that we will be depending on inside the joke component is going to be the votes of that joke, the upvote and the downvote buttons. So we can connect. So when we click on upvote and downvote on that button, we can access that. So we can call the jokes list over here to upvote and downvote. For now, we want to pass in the votes for that joke, the text for that joke, and the key for the joke, so that it will be optimized when we give it a key. So let's give it the votes, which is going to be jokes.votes. After we have done the votes, we'll do the text. So we can pass it in now, and it will be joke.text. And finally, for the key, we are just going to do the j.id, joke.id, sorry. Now let's go to joke, so we can receive these parameter from in this component, and we can receive it as props, or we can use object destructuring, but I'm not going to do object destructuring now. I'm just going to I'm going to destructure it from the props over here. I could do it over here as well, but just for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to do it over here. And the properties that we will be using is going to be the votes. First of all, the votes and the text, and that should be it. So we don't need the key right now, and we can get this from the props. So simply getting the votes and text from our props, and now we can use the votes over here. Instead of putting 0, we'll actually put in the votes. And we want to pass in the text as well. We want to put it in the box elements. So instead of having the static text, we will use the text from the props. And now let's see how that looks. So if we refresh, we are actually using the data from our API. Okay, so this looks quite strange. We are overflowing. We want to do overflow scroll, which we already have done over here inside jokes list, but the issue is we have used capital letter. So make sure you have overflow in one word, because the convention in React tells you for the second word you use a capital letter, like border, top, right, radius. We have used a capital letter. This is called, I think, camel case convention. So for the overflow, it should be capital, but in this case, it's not a capital for some reason, because it turns out because it's one word, and that should fix our issue. Now we we have the jokes all in one list. That's why when they overflow, we can scroll through them rather than getting them overlaid.